the stepmother decided to take away the girl's hair to erase the last memory of her mother. She took her to the salon and had already started shaving her head. But at that moment, the father walked in and saw everything with his own eyes. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Edward Harper had built his life on discipline and determination. From a modest upbringing in a small Midwestern town, he had risen to become one of the most respected entrepreneurs in his city, known for his string of boutique hotels and countryside retreats that catered to those who wanted refinement without pretense. His success was the kind that seemed permanent, almost immovable, and for many who watched from the outside, he appeared to live a charmed life. Yet beneath the polished surface of his reputation lay a grief that time had never fully eased. Several years earlier, Edward's wife, Margaret, had passed away after a drawn-out illness that left him a widower and his young daughter, Lily, motherless before she had even learned how to spell the word. Margaret had been a warm, spirited woman whose presence filled every room she entered. She had long, wavy blonde hair that Lily loved to brush in the evenings, sitting at her mother's feet as if tending to a golden crown. When Margaret died, that ritual vanished, but the memory of it stayed rooted in the little girl's heart. To Lily, her own hair was more than just hair. It was a connection, a fragile living thread tying her to the mother she could barely remember, but desperately wanted to hold on to. For Edward, the years after Margaret's passing became a blur of work and avoidance. He buried himself in his business ventures, expanding his hotels, traveling between cities, filling his calendar so tightly that he barely left room for stillness. Stillness meant reflection, and reflection meant remembering what he had lost. To the world, he was the image of resilience, but inside, he was hollowed by absence. He convinced himself that building more, earning more, and keeping busy were ways of protecting Lily, of creating a future for her. In truth, he was retreating from the responsibility of facing her grief along with his own. Lily grew quietly in those years, a girl who spent afternoons sketching on scraps of paper, hiding in corners of the house where the silence felt less oppressive. She was delicate, but not weak, reserved, but observant. She adored her father, but sensed the distance that had crept between them. She never doubted his love, but she felt the void of the mother who used to sing to her at bedtime, and the father who now came home too late for songs at all. It was in this fragile balance that Victoria entered their lives. Edward met her at a charity event, where she stood out in a red silk dress, her laughter ringing like glass. She came from a family that prided itself on refinement, on old money that carried an air of entitlement, though she presented herself as warm and sophisticated. For Edward, weary of loneliness and flattered by her attention, she seemed like a second chance. For Lily, she was a stranger who quickly occupied spaces that had once belonged only to her and her father. At first, Victoria's presence appeared harmless. She was attentive to Edward's needs, quick with compliments in public, and eager to involve herself in the routines of his household. To the outside world, she was everything a successful man might want in a companion: elegant, socially adept, and unfailingly composed. But behind closed doors, her demeanor shifted, sharpening like glass beneath a smooth surface. It began with small comments, easily dismissed if overheard. She would glance at Lily's hair and murmur that it looked untamed. She would adjust the girl's dress before a dinner and remark that she looked a little shabby. At the dinner table, she criticized the way Lily held her fork or the way she slouched in her chair. None of it was said loudly enough for Edward to hear, and Lily, timid and unsure, never repeated it to him. The criticisms grew over time, threading their way into daily life until Lily began to dread Victoria's gaze. What once had been a safe home began to feel like a stage where she was perpetually failing to meet invisible expectations. The focus always returned to her hair, those waves that carried the memory of Margaret. To Victoria, the hair symbolized disorder, a wildness she wanted to control, and perhaps a reminder that no matter what role she played, she would never replace the mother who had come before her. When Edward was home, Victoria softened her tone, speaking with a careful warmth that concealed her sharper edges. She praised Lily's efforts at school, encouraged her hobbies, and played the part of a caring stepmother. But when he traveled or stayed late at the office, her mask slipped. In those hours, she treated Lily not as a child to be nurtured, but as a problem to be corrected. She lectured her about posture, manners, and appearance, always returning to the refrain that her hair made her look wild and unpresentable. Lily began to shrink into herself. She wore her hair tied back tightly, as if hiding it could silence the criticisms. She spent more time alone in her room, sketching not playful animals or bright scenes, but dark shapes, abstract tangles of lines that spoke of confusion and fear. When her father asked about her drawings, she brushed them off as practice. He accepted the answer, distracted by meetings and deadlines, never imagining the quiet suffering happening under his roof. Edward's absence in those critical moments became the soil in which Victoria's cruelty grew. He trusted her completely, convinced by her polished public image and reassured by the occasional affectionate word she offered Lily when he was near. To him, the household seemed steady, even healed. He believed he had found someone who could bring balance back into their lives. But Lily knew otherwise. She learned to hold back tears until she was alone, to endure the cold comments without protest. She thought that perhaps she deserved them, that maybe she truly was unruly, unkempt, unworthy of gentleness. She was too young to recognize manipulation, too loyal to her father to risk sowing conflict, and too frightened of Victoria's disapproval to speak. By the time Lily turned 7, the tension had woven itself into the fabric of daily life. She carried herself with a cautiousness beyond her years, always alert to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, always bracing for another critique. And though she tried to cling to the memory of her mother, running her fingers through her own hair as though it might conjure the comfort she had lost, she felt the memory slipping further away each day. The house was still grand, the meals still polished, and the smiles in public still convincing, but shadows had settled into the corners where light once dwelled. For Edward, those shadows remained invisible, hidden by the bright facade of his new wife. For Lily, they were suffocating, wrapping around her like a cloak she could never remove. And so the stage was set, a father blind in his grief, a stepmother tightening her grip, and a little girl whose silent endurance was about to be tested in ways no child should have to endure. The storm was gathering, and though none of them knew it yet, the day would come when the hidden cruelty of this household would break into the open, leaving scars that could never be unseen. The shadows that had crept silently into Lily's life began to press more heavily upon her in the weeks that followed. The days that had once been filled with small rituals of comfort, the sketches she loved to make, the evenings she tried to remember her mother by brushing out her own hair, were now dominated by an ever-present sense of watchfulness. She had learned to anticipate the sharp tone in Victoria's voice, to shrink before her critical eyes, to tuck herself into corners where she might go unnoticed. But no matter how quiet she became, no matter how tightly she tied her hair back or tried to present herself neatly, Victoria's dissatisfaction only seemed to deepen. It was as if her very existence was an affront to the perfect image her stepmother longed to project. Edward, for all his success and his steady hand in business, remained oblivious. He saw in his wife a graceful partner who stood confidently by his side at social events, a woman who kept the household in meticulous order. When she suggested that Lily could use a change in appearance, a gentle refinement, to help her feel more poised and confident, he accepted her words without question. To him, it sounded like care, an effort to help his daughter adapt, perhaps even a way to heal the unspoken rift left by Margaret's absence. He had no idea of the severity of her intentions, no inkling that beneath the polished suggestion lay something cruel and absolute. The decision was made without consultation, presented to Lily as a matter already determined. She would be going to the salon with Victoria, who insisted it was time to correct what she called years of neglect. Lily's heart sank as soon as the words were spoken. She knew instinctively that this wasn't a gift, not an outing meant for her benefit, but another attempt to erase something essential from her. She wanted to protest, but the silence she had learned to keep held her tongue still. She lowered her eyes, nodded faintly, and prepared for a day she already dreaded. The morning of the visit dawned crisp and cold, with a weak sun struggling against gray clouds. Lily dressed slowly, her fingers clumsy as she tied the ribbons of her shoes. She let her hair fall loosely, the way her mother had worn it, as though clinging to the last trace of comfort it offered. When Victoria appeared, elegant in a fitted coat, and with her hair pinned into a flawless chignon, the contrast was painful. Without a word, she placed her gloved hand on Lily's shoulder and guided her out the door, her grip firm enough to remind the child there would be no escape. The salon itself was a gleaming place of glass and light, filled with the sharp scent of hairsprays and chemical dyes. Women sat in cushioned chairs beneath chrome fixtures, their laughter rising above the low hum of dryers. Stylists in black smocks moved briskly between stations, their arms laden with tools. To Lily, it all felt overwhelming, a place that belonged to a world she could never inhabit. She was ushered into one of the large chairs, a cape draped around her shoulders, and before she could even breathe deeply, she was confronted by the reflection of herself in the enormous mirror that stretched across the wall. Her wide eyes stared back at her, anxious and pleading, while Victoria stood behind her with a smile that looked nothing like kindness. At first, the stylist approached with hesitation, comb in hand, asking politely how much to trim. But Victoria's voice cut across the question, smooth and commanding. She instructed the stylist to cut everything, to shave it down to the scalp. The stylist faltered, unsure, glancing at Lily, who sat frozen in terror. The child's fingers tightened beneath the cape, gripping the fabric as though it could shield her. When the stylist hesitated again, murmuring something about the extremity of such a cut, Victoria's expression hardened. She reached across the counter herself, seizing the clippers with a swiftness that startled everyone nearby. The hum of the machine filled the air, a low and menacing vibration. Lily whimpered, but made no sound beyond that, too frightened to cry out. Victoria pressed the clippers against the crown of her head and dragged them through, leaving a bald stripe in the middle of her hair. Strands of gold tumbled down the cape, falling into her lap, scattering across the floor like the remnants of something sacred being destroyed. The left side of her head remained covered in the waves that reminded her of her mother, while the right was bare, pale skin gleaming under the harsh salon lights. The grotesque unevenness of it mirrored the brokenness she felt inside, a division between what she had once held onto and what was being stripped from her without mercy. Gasps sounded softly from nearby clients who tried to avert their eyes yet could not fully look away. Stylists exchanged nervous glances, torn between professionalism and horror. But no one stepped forward to intervene, cowed by the authority in Victoria's movements and the icy glare she cast toward anyone who lingered too long. For Lily, the room seemed to vanish into silence, her world reduced to the sound of the clippers and the sight of herself half-shorn, a spectacle of humiliation. Tears spilled down her cheeks, unchecked and unstoppable. She tried to cover her face with her small hands, but the cape trapped her arms, making her clumsy and helpless. The sensation of the machine buzzing against her scalp returned, more hair falling away, though unevenly, for Victoria's strokes were not those of a practiced hand, but of someone driven by spite. The result was crueler than even the complete shaving she had demanded. It left Lily looking like a figure mocked by her own reflection, with patches of hair clinging stubbornly to one side, the other stripped bare. Just as the clippers were raised again, just as the humiliation threatened to deepen into something irreparable, the doors at the far end of the salon opened with force. The sound broke through the haze, and all heads turned. Edward had arrived, his tall frame filling the entryway, his eyes sweeping the room until they landed on his daughter. In an instant, his composure, the careful businessman's calm he carried into every room, shattered. He saw not only the half-shorn head of his little girl, but the tears on her face, the fear in her posture, the machine still in Victoria's grasp. Time seemed to slow. The weight of the scene fell upon him like a crushing stone, the realization of betrayal striking harder than any blow he had ever known. He moved forward, every step deliberate, his voice low, but edged with a fury that silenced the room. His hand reached for Lily, pulling her against him, shielding what remained of her hair with his palm. The clippers fell silent as Victoria's hand faltered, her poise crumbling under his gaze. The mask she had worn for so long slipped away, revealing the cruel determination beneath it. The salon stood frozen, caught between shock and relief, as father and daughter clung to each other. Lily buried her face against Edward's chest, her sobs muffled by his shirt, while he held her, as though to fuse her brokenness back into wholeness. The damage had already been done. Her hair lay scattered on the floor, the humiliation carved into her memory. But in that moment, Edward finally saw the truth he had missed for so long. The cruelty that had festered in silence now stood exposed, undeniable, irreversible. That day marked the end of the illusion. No more could Edward convince himself that his wife was the caring presence she pretended to be. No more could Lily remain silent, her suffering hidden behind lowered eyes. The line had been crossed, carved as clearly as the bald stripe across her scalp. And though the moment was soaked in pain, it also carried the first spark of change, the first step toward a reckoning that would alter the course of their lives forever. The silence that followed Edward's intervention in the salon carried home with them like an invisible shadow. For Lily, the ride back was a blur of blurred streetlights and the tightness of her father's arms around her, as though he feared she might disappear if he let go. She rested against him, exhausted from crying, half her head bare, and the other half tangled with uneven strands. The cape from the salon had long been discarded, but the humiliation clung to her more tightly than any fabric could. Edward sat rigid beside her, his jaw locked, his thoughts unraveling at a pace he could barely contain. He had spent years convincing himself that Victoria's presence was a stabilizing force, that her polished manner and quiet suggestions meant care. In a single hour, that illusion had collapsed, and all he could see now was the image of his daughter, weeping, while his wife pressed clippers against her head with merciless determination. When they reached the house, Edward moved swiftly. He took Lily upstairs, gently guiding her into the bathroom and closing the door against the rest of the world. He sat her on the edge of the tub, dampened a soft cloth, and carefully wiped her tear-stained cheeks. He found a scarf in the closet, one Margaret had once worn, and tied it loosely around Lily's head, hiding the patchy scalp beneath folds of pale fabric. It did little to disguise what had been done, but it shielded her from the coldness of her own reflection. She clutched at it with small hands, grateful for the cover, though the weight of what she had endured pressed so deeply into her that no cloth could ease it. Downstairs, the air was heavy with confrontation. Victoria paced in the living room, her expression alternating between indignation and wounded pride. She rehearsed words of justification, but they sounded hollow even to her. When Edward finally came down, his presence filled the space with a gravity that silenced her pretense. He told her with unwavering calm that she would no longer be a part of their home. There was no raised voice, no theatrical rage, only a clarity so sharp it could cut. He spoke of what he had seen, of the betrayal not only of his trust, but of the sanctity of a child's innocence. Victoria tried to argue, tried to twist her actions into gestures of discipline and guidance, but her words slid off him like water against stone. By the end of the night, arrangements had been made. Within days, she would be gone, and the marriage that had seemed to promise stability would dissolve into memory and bitterness. For Lily, the absence of Victoria was both a relief and a wound. The cruelty had ended, but its echo remained. In the days that followed, she avoided mirrors, wrapping the scarf more tightly around her head whenever she ventured beyond her room. She could not bear the sight of herself half-shorn, a grotesque reminder of humiliation. The scarf became her shield, a fragile barrier between herself and the eyes of the world. Yet the world noticed. At school, whispers followed her through the hallways. Children who had once played beside her now stared, curious and unkind, their laughter edged with cruelty she could not ignore. Some mimicked the buzzing of clippers, others tugged at their own hair in mock imitation. Teachers tried to hush the cruelty, but the damage was done. Each day was a gauntlet of humiliation, and Lily shrank further into herself, hiding behind lowered eyes and quick steps. Edward watched helplessly as his daughter retreated. At night, he lingered outside her room, listening to the silence within, longing to hear the sound of her laughter, which seemed to have vanished completely. Guilt gnawed at him with relentless persistence. He replayed the months and years leading up to that day, seeing with painful clarity the moments he had missed, the signs he had ignored. Every late night at the office, every blind acceptance of Victoria's carefully chosen words seemed like a personal failure. He realized that while he had been building a business empire, his daughter had been enduring torment under his roof. He had sworn to protect her, and instead, he had abandoned her to a woman who saw her as an obstacle rather than a child. Determined to repair what had been broken, Edward began to change. He cut back his hours at the office, delegating responsibilities he once hoarded for himself. He insisted on walking Lily to school, waiting with her until the bell rang, and being there again at the end of the day. At first, she responded with wary silence, unused to his constant presence, but gradually the weight of his consistency began to chip away at her fear. He spent evenings beside her, not demanding conversation, but offering it when she was ready. He praised her drawings, encouraged her to choose new paints and pencils, and slowly she began to fill the pages again, this time with gentler shapes and softer lines. He also sought help beyond his own efforts. A family therapist began visiting the house, speaking with Lily in gentle tones, guiding her toward words she had never dared to use. It was difficult at first. Lily resisted, embarrassed by her tears, hesitant to expose wounds that felt too raw. But over time, she began to speak of her fear of Victoria, of the shame she felt when she looked in the mirror, of the weight of believing she had been unworthy of kindness. The sessions became a fragile bridge, each word another step away from silence, and toward healing. The physical scars of the ordeal also needed tending. Edward took Lily to a stylist he trusted, a woman who had known Margaret and understood the significance of what had been lost. She trimmed the uneven patches, shaped what little remained into something deliberate, something that looked less like cruelty and more like a new beginning. She spoke gently to Lily as she worked, reminding her that hair grows, that time can restore what had been taken. Lily listened, clutching her father's hand throughout the process, her eyes fixed on the mirror, not with pride, but with a tentative acceptance. In the weeks that followed, Lily's trust in her father deepened. She began to leave her room more often, to sit with him during meals, to share small stories from her day at school. He responded with patience, never pressing too hard, never allowing his guilt to push her faster than she was ready to go. For the first time in years, he was fully present, not as a provider alone, but as a father. She began to sense that his love was not only real, but active, a force that would not falter again. Still, the scars of humiliation lingered. At school, the whispers had not fully stopped, and Lily carried the fear of ridicule like a hidden burden. Yet even in those moments, she clung to the certainty that her father stood with her, that she was no longer alone in her battles. The house, once a stage for cruelty, began to feel like a refuge again, though the memory of shadows lingered in its corners. The bond between father and daughter, forged in grief and tested by betrayal, began to take on new strength. It was not the easy comfort of days long past, when Margaret's laughter still filled the air, but something harder and more enduring, a closeness born of survival. Edward no longer saw Lily as simply his child, but as the center of his life, the one truth he could not afford to neglect. And Lily, though still fragile, began to see in her father not only the man who had once failed to notice, but the man who had finally chosen to fight for her. The break with Victoria had torn their lives open, exposing wounds that could not be easily healed. But it had also cleared the path for something truer to emerge. Amid the pain, amid the lingering humiliation, a fragile trust was taking root, promising that the worst had passed and that new strength could rise from its ashes. The weeks that followed were shaped by a rhythm of slow healing. Lily's days were no longer defined by the harsh presence of Victoria, but the shadows the woman had left behind were not easily erased. Every morning when she dressed for school, she lingered before the mirror, touching the scarf tied carefully around her head. Beneath it, her hair was uneven but growing, the rough patches softening into new beginnings. She still flinched when she caught her reflection, but the flinch was beginning to fade, replaced by something quieter, an awareness that what had been taken from her could return, and that her identity was not bound entirely to what had been stripped away. Edward watched this transformation with cautious hope. His heart remained heavy with guilt, but he clung to the evidence of change. The way Lily began to sit straighter at the table, the way she started drawing again in the evenings, the way she no longer avoided every mirror in the house. He saw in her a resilience that humbled him, a strength he had failed to recognize before. It was as though the very act meant to destroy her had instead awakened something deeper, something unshakable. At school, the whispers had not entirely disappeared. Children could be cruel, and the half-remembered story of the day Lily returned with a shaved head clung to her like a rumor that refused to die. Some still laughed, some pointed, but others began to see something beyond the humiliation. When Lily walked into class with her scarf tied boldly, meeting their eyes without lowering her gaze, the laughter grew uncertain. A teacher spoke quietly with her, praising her bravery, and soon the story shifted from ridicule to recognition. She was no longer merely the girl who had been shorn, but the girl who carried herself with dignity despite it. Edward encouraged her in small ways, never forcing, but always present. He suggested she speak about her drawings to her classmates, and though she hesitated, she agreed. When she presented her work, hands trembling slightly as she held up the pages, filled with bright new shapes and hopeful colors, the room fell quiet. For the first time, her peers saw not the uneven hair beneath the scarf, but the light of someone who had endured and continued to create. That moment planted a seed of confidence in her, one that would grow steadily in the months ahead. The transformation within their home mirrored this change. Edward no longer buried himself in work as he once had. He structured his days to end with dinner at the table, conversations with Lily, evenings where they read together or took slow walks through the neighborhood. He began to share stories of Margaret, stories he had once locked away out of grief. Lily listened intently, treasuring each detail about the mother she barely remembered. Those stories filled the silence that had once suffocated the house, weaving threads of memory into the fabric of their daily life. In hearing them, Lily discovered not only who her mother had been, but also the strength she had inherited from her. The bond between father and daughter grew into something unbreakable. Edward was no longer only a provider or a distant figure she longed to please. He became her protector, her confidant, the one who listened and understood. And she, in turn, became the center of his purpose, the reason he no longer saw business as the measure of his success, but family as the truest measure of all. It was not long before Edward took his resolve beyond the walls of their home. The memory of what Victoria had done, the image of his daughter humiliated in a public salon, left him unable to remain silent. He founded a charitable initiative in Margaret's name, one dedicated to protecting children from emotional and psychological abuse within families. The foundation began small, offering counseling services, outreach programs in schools, and safe spaces for children who needed to speak. But word spread quickly, and soon it became a cause that drew support from across the community. Lily found herself drawn into this work almost naturally. At first, she attended meetings quietly, sitting beside her father, listening as adults spoke of plans and strategies. But eventually, someone asked her if she wished to share her own experience. The thought terrified her, yet something inside urged her forward. When she stood before a small group of parents and teachers, scarf tied securely around her head, she spoke softly at first, recounting the day in the salon, the fear, the shame, the helplessness. But as the words spilled out, her voice grew steadier. She told them what it felt like to lose more than hair, to feel as though the last tie to her mother had been stripped away. She told them how she had begun to rebuild, how her father's support had given her the strength to face mirrors again. When she finished, the room was silent, and then applause rose not out of politeness, but from genuine recognition of her courage. That moment marked a turning point. Lily realized that her story could mean something beyond her own pain. It could give voice to other children who felt silenced, who thought they had no one to protect them. She began speaking more often, at schools, at small community events, and eventually at larger gatherings where her words reached hundreds. Each time she told her story, the humiliation that had once burned so deeply lost a little of its power. In its place grew a sense of purpose, a knowledge that what had been meant to destroy her had become her source of strength. Her hair, by then, had begun to grow in thick and healthy waves, curling around her face once more. But by the time it reached her shoulders, she no longer clung to it as her identity. She still loved it, still saw in it a reflection of her mother, but she knew she would be whole even without it. The scarf she once used to hide became an accessory she chose on occasion, not out of shame, but as a reminder of the journey she had endured. Edward often watched her in awe, marveling at how she had transformed from a child silenced by fear into a young girl whose voice carried weight and meaning. He saw in her the legacy of Margaret, but also something uniquely her own, a resilience neither of them could have foreseen. When he looked at her, he no longer saw the victim of cruelty, but the embodiment of survival, someone who had been broken and rebuilt stronger than before. The final test came when whispers reached them that Victoria wished to return, to apologize, to seek forgiveness. Edward bristled at the thought, ready to shield Lily from any further contact. But it was Lily herself who made the decision. She listened quietly as her father explained, then shook her head. She did not rage. She did not weep. She simply said that forgiveness was hers to give or withhold, and she did not feel it was owed. In that moment, Edward realized just how far she had come. She was no longer defined by what had been done to her, but by the choices she now had the power to make. On a quiet evening months later, Lily stood before her mirror once more. Her hair had grown into a halo of soft waves, but she no longer measured herself by its length or texture. She smiled at her reflection, not because it was perfect, but because it was hers. She touched the glass lightly, as though greeting the girl who had once sat, terrified in a salon chair, and whispered a silent promise that she would never again be made to feel small. The crown she bore was invisible, yet undeniable. It was not in the hair that had been stripped from her, nor in the approval of others, but in the dignity she carried, the strength she had discovered, and the voice she had found. No hand could ever take that from her again. And so the story of humiliation became a story of resilience. The day of cruelty had left scars, but it had also uncovered the unyielding core of a child who learned to rise above it. For Edward and Lily, the path ahead was not without challenges, but it was one they would walk together, bound not by fear, but by love, and crowned not by appearance, but by an inner strength that could never be shorn away. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more stories you won't want to miss. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.